Joining me now from Washington, D.C. is James Phillips. He's a senior research fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. And from Jerusalem, we're joined by Holly Dagres. She is a Middle East analyst at the Atlantic Council, where she specializes in U.S.-Iran relations. Thanks both so much for joining us. Holly, let me start with you. Trump campaigned on a platform that getting tough on Iran was what was needed for the sake of the United States and for the sake of the world. And the U.S. public bought it. Have they been duped?
It's very complicated. If we actually go back to Trump's rhetoric before he ran for office, in 2011, he actually said that he was open to talking to hardliner President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And so it wasn't until we really saw him run for office in the 2016 U.S. presidential elections did we really see him going after the Iran nuclear deal. Right now, Trump likes to say that these are the most punitive sanctions that Iran has ever faced with. But the truth is, the most punitive sanctions in Iran's history were under the Obama administration, when they were multilateral, when Iran was sanctioned not just by the United States, but the European Union and the United Nations. So though Trump likes to say that this is really going to change Iran's behavior, I highly doubt that.
So what will they do?
What they'll do is hurt the Iranian people first and foremost. I think there's a confusion with the effectiveness of sanctions versus the impact. We've already been hearing about the impact on the ground for the Iranian people. Some have come and spoke to channels like BBC Persian about how they haven't been able to buy meat in weeks, that they're not able to travel, and that the Iranian rial has been crumbling in the lead up to these sanctions being re-implemented. So what we're really seeing now is that these sanctions are hurting the Iranian people. And while we'd like to think that they're hurting the Iranian government has a history of relying on black markets to actually circumvent these sanctions. And they've had a history of doing it before, and they're going to do what they've done before, which is they're going to turn off trackers on oil tankers. They're going to rely on countries like Afghanistan and Iraq to do a lot of their smuggling. And they're just going to resort to the ways and means of before.
Okay, James, do you accept that? I mean, particularly first and foremost, that these sanctions will primarily hurt the Iranian people?
Well, I think the sanctions will, in part, hurt the Iranian people, but the primary target and the main entity that will be affected is the Iranian regime. The sanctions are aimed at Iranian oil revenues, which are controlled by the regime, and those oil revenues hardly ever trickle down to the people. And that is one of the problems with the previous nuclear agreement, in which Western companies rushed in to do deals. They were doing deals primarily with giant industrial and commercial enterprises controlled by the regime. So the Iranian people saw very few benefits of the relaxation of sanctions. And I think that goes to the point of the degree that the regime controls the economy, and the fact that the regime's corruption, economic mismanagement, and warped priorities mean that the Iranian people don't see much economic benefits from the oil wealth. And I think that one benefit of the sanctions will be that it will make it much more difficult for the regime to apply its adventurous foreign policy in places like Syria and Yemen and Afghanistan.
But as Holly was saying, I mean, it really doesn't affect the regime in the sense that the regime is used to using the black market to reap the benefits of the oil market, and it will do so again to the detriment, really, of the entire region.
It will try to escape from the brunt of sanctions, and I don't think these sanctions will be as strong as the previous sanctions, because not all countries are participating. But these sanctions will put a huge dent in the ability of the regime to finance its military buildup, its foreign adventures in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Afghanistan, and also address the very real needs of the Iranian people, which keep protesting to bring the regime's attention to their needs.
Okay, James, I'm quickly going to stick with you, though. I just need you to tell us what the U.S. really gains from this by further isolating Iran? Why is it good for the United States?
It's good for the U.S. because it drives up the costs of Iran's support of terrorism, its support of surrogate networks around the world, and its continued efforts to destabilize regimes in the Middle East. That by lessening Iran's threat to Iranians' neighbors and to the U.S. allies, that is a net benefit for the U.S. people.
Okay, Holly, do you accept that?
I mean, these sanctions, if we're going to look at them in terms of being smart sanctions, yes, they're supposed to target the Iranian government and target the regional ambitions in Iraq and Syria. But we have to also remember that at the height of these punitive sanctions under the Obama administration in 2013, Iran was already in Syria, and that was the worst. It was some of the worst times in Syria's history in terms of the civil war. That was when the chemical weapons were initially being used, and it didn't make much of a difference. What I'm seeing here is that the Trump administration is resorting to some of the same old tactics of chants about regime change, war, and sanctions. And we haven't seen much of a change since then. I think what the Trump administration should have done is actually use the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, as an example of a confidence-building measure, and then sat down with Tehran to talk about other things, whether it be its regional ambitions, what its harassment of boats in the Persian Gulf, and so on and so forth. So this could have actually been a great opportunity for the Trump administration to approach the Iranian government, which essentially Trump has said he was willing to talk to. So I think they're really just taking a step back and following the same old tactics of previous administrations, with the exception of the Obama administration.
And Holly, why do you think they're doing this? The Iranians have said this really is because of the instigation of Israel and Saudi. Is there some truth to that, do you think?
Well, I mean, there is some truth to that for the Iranian government. They look at everything as more of a threat of regime change. Their raison d'etre is to go against the United States and Israel, and partly because there has been a history of regime change in Iran. We have the 1953 coup d'etat of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. They have the backing of the Shah, despite the countless human rights violations he's committed. So the Iranians are looking at the history in the past, and they're looking at how are we going to defend ourselves? We don't have the military capabilities of Israel and Saudi Arabia. We're relying on military hardware that predates the 1979 revolution. So they're relying on proxies throughout the region in case there is a possibility of a war, whether it's led by the United States or Israel. And unfortunately, this is something they've been feeling for a long time, especially since the post-9/11 world with the U.S. invading Afghanistan and Iraq. They felt like they were in a tight bind. So their regional ambitions have only expanded as a result of the vacuum that the United States has imposed in the region.
Okay, James, let me put this to you, because some who oppose the sanctions argued that the Iranian regime was actually on the verge of breakdown because of internal issues that it couldn't deal with. The breakdown of its economy being entirely the fault, as you had said, of its own mismanagement. And that could have actually, if not toppled the regime, forced reform upon it. Now they're arguing that what Trump has done could actually backfire by giving the Iranian regime a scapegoat, by being able to blame the U.S., again, for all of its economic woes, even when it was in large part of their own making. Do you accept that?
No, I don't, because the regime has used the U.S. as a scapegoat from the very beginning, and its incessant chants of death to America are a sign that, it already blames the U.S. for all of its problems. And as we've seen in recent protests, they continue to chant death to the dictator rather than death to America. So it shows that Iran's people blame the regime for the economic problems. They still don't blame the U.S. sanctions for them. And indeed, the sanctions really haven't hit yet. But there is a chance in the future, once they really do hit, that the U.S. could be blamed for those problems. And I think that's one reason why Secretary of State Pompeo is correct to stress that the U.S. stands with the Iranian people and is willing to reopen perfectly normal relations once Iran's radical regime stops trying to undermine the neighboring governments and export its revolution, which it's been doing since 1979.
Okay. Holly, let me address this with you. We all know these were unilateral sanctions. Europe tried very hard to stop the United States from pulling out of the nuclear deal with Iran. And Javad Zarif had said, as we saw in that report, that the world is sick of the United States unilateralism and that this move will actually backfire on the U.S. But I'm going to ask you, even if the world is sick of unilateralism, do they have a choice? Is there any way the world can bypass the U.S. at this point?
I think you raised an important question. For the European Union right now, they're kind of stuck in a bind because here they are trying to tell their companies that have invested in Iran post JCPOA to stay in the country and don't worry about it. We'll deal with the Trump administration. But even before some of the sanctions had hit, a lot of these companies were pulling out. And so even though there are European officials saying that they're trying to take care of things and they've just given an aid package to Iran to help with investment, it doesn't mean that they're able to prevent the Trump administration from implementing these sanctions and actually threatening these companies that do mostly business in the United States and are multinational companies. So the European Union can promise these things, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to trickle down to these companies.
Okay, James, is the United States kind of abusing its power and influence, as Javad Zarif has said?
I believe the United States has been bending over backwards to show restraint. The U.S. still hasn't reacted to the Iran failed plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in a Washington restaurant in 2011. That plot was traced back to the Quds Force of the Revolutionary Guards. The Obama administration did not react to that, but that is an example of the kind of terrorism that Iran has gotten away with. In that case, the plot was foiled. But in other cases, such as the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, the Chancery Annex, the taking of American hostages, not only in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, but 15 American hostages taken by Hezbollah at Iran's orders in Lebanon. Those are long-standing acts of terrorism that Iran has gotten away with. And the sanctions are a means of putting pressure on Iran to stop those type of activities without having to go to war. Now, if the U.S. didn't impose sanctions, I guess some people may be happy that it would go to war instead with Iran. But I think it's correct to try sanctions and diplomacy first.
Okay, Holly, if you had a response, you can go ahead quickly. If not, I'd like to finish on one final point with you.
Please, I just wanted to add on the Saudi front. A lot of the best CIA analysts in Washington have all come out and said that that was very hard to believe that Iran was involved, and it was quite sloppy. So, I mean, there are other examples to point to, but I think that one's kind of a faulty one, so I just wanted to add that.
Okay, great. Holly, let's just finish, then we'll bring it full circle back to the introduction we actually gave and kind of the newest line in this saga, and Iran taking the United States to court over a 1955 friendship treaty that was signed long before the Iranian Revolution. What are the chances of success suing the United States for not adhering to that treaty from decades ago?
Well, the treaty is very fascinating. It's, as you said, it's something from 1955, but the United States and Iran have heavily relied on this treaty to sue each other over the decades, whether it was during the Iran hostage crisis or during the Iran-Iraq war. So though the Trump administration is saying this treaty is irrelevant and no longer binding, there are previous U.S. administrations that have heavily relied on it. Whether Iran will succeed, it's really hard to tell. I'm not a lawyer, but at the end of the day, I think what's more important to note is that these sanctions are being implemented, and Iran will find ways to means like it has in the past to circumvent them.
Okay. Holly, I'm going to have to give you the last word. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank both of you so much for joining us.